We need to start with some positive news from Mexico. Andres Obrador, that country's leftist candidate, populist center-left candidate, depending on how we're defining the terminology, the candidate certainly of the left electoral preference in Mexico, was elected president just a couple of days ago. And before we break this down further and get into the incredible failings of John Oliver when speaking about Latin America, let's play a clip of the president-elect Obrador, which, by the way, translates to something analogous to a worker, I am told, into English, which is an interesting namesake. Here he is really indicating that he is more of a Lula than a Chavez as he speaks to supporters in his victory rally. Andres López Obrador.
The new project of the nation will seek to establish an authentic democracy. We don't bet on building an open or closed dictatorship. The changes will be profound, but will happen with a strict adherence to the legal established order. There will be corporate freedom, freedom of expression, of association, and of beliefs. We will guarantee all the individual and social freedoms, as well as the political rights of citizens, consecrated in our Constitution. There will be no need to increase taxes in real terms, not for the country to fall into debt. There will also be no hikes in petrol. I will lower the general cost of living and the public investment to propel productive activities and to create jobs. The objective is to strengthen the internal market, to try to produce what we consume in the country. We won't act in an arbitrary way, and there will be no confiscation or expropriation of property. The transformation will consist in basically banishing corruption from our country. We won't have a problem in achieving this objective because the people of Mexico are the heir of great civilizations.
So let's be clear. He's talking about a corruption which is very serious in Mexico. And he is, in some ways, obviously ruling out much more radical reforms, which will, in fact, need to happen. But the nexus of cartels and the main political parties, besides Morena, the newly formed party created by Andres López Obrador, along with the traditional oligarchic and corrupt interests and clientelist networks that run Mexican politics, do feed a system of corruption which entrenches and overlaps with U.S. foreign policy, Western corporate interests, United States corporate interests, to a system that not only doesn't work, but now has actually accelerated violence, brutality, and neoliberal entrenchment. So he's right about that. He might be soft-pedaling other things. As I say, he's clearly trying to position himself in the Lula mode more than the Chavez mode, which the far-right campaigned against him as. Now, all that being said, does that speech remind you of anybody else? Well, about a week or so ago, a couple weeks ago, another speech, or his more accurately, his campaigning in general, did make Obrador remind John Oliver of another figure.
AMLO's goals may be clear, but the details of how he plans to achieve them can be pretty sketchy. His opponents have attacked him as a dangerous leftist, but journalists who've covered him say it's hard to judge things based on his policy platforms because they're prone to change, often seemingly overnight, and that he often makes big promises while keeping his own advisors guessing as to what he really means. So in that way, he's actually more reminiscent of a Mexican Donald Trump, which I know is a weird image to conjure up, like Orthodox Hitler or...
So that's ridiculous, condescending, and foolish on so many levels, it could almost make you nauseous. In fact, it does make me nauseous. The arrogant, paternalist stupidity of that comment. Cursory research would show you two really clear things. One, Andres López Obrador comes from the left tradition, which has almost entirely died inside the PRI, the Institutional Revolutionary Party of Mexico, a party which has existed for over 70 years and did contain a populist left contingent in the 70s, when Opador got his start in politics. He later would leave the party, found another party that was a party of the left, and more recently, AMLO, as he is called there, and his commonly used nickname, would go on to found Morena, a new party, because in fact of a falling out with the left breakoff party because of their falls into corruption and clientelism. We also know that he was a successful leader of Mexico City. That's his ideology. And the compromises and networks that he has built to win this election, some of which are very unappealing and very problematic, are the product of the constituency building and coalition assembly that any single candidate would have to do in order to win in any democracy. John Oliver's arrogance and delusion and obsession with details, by the way, details about policy that AMLO supposedly is not fulfilling, while John Oliver cannot fulfill the details of AMLO's politics with a staff of however many people he has at HBO. None of that in the segment. Just a bunch of bullshit about, well, it sounds like Trump, I guess, because, you know, they both don't like the elites or some other nonsense. And this fits a pattern. John Oliver recently did another segment on Venezuela. Let's condense this down really simply. I've said before, I'm not going to defend certain policies of the Maduro government and not be real about Venezuela. But from a U.S. perspective, I would argue that the most important and paramount thing is to oppose U.S. intervention and destabilization of sovereign nations, period. The United States supported a coup under the Bush administration in 2002, a fact that Oliver didn't even mention in a segment where he blithely dismissed all talk from the Venezuelan government about U.S. interference. Okay, 2002, I guess that's a little bit ago. Maybe it's not relevant to mention that we actively celebrated a coup when you're dismissing Maduro's fears as delusions, because, I don't know, that might get in the way of a Maduro empanada joke or something you're trying to land. Okay, fair enough. But how about in 2017, Mike Pompeo, as head of the CIA, now head of the State Department, publicly saying that the agency was looking for ways of dislodging the Venezuelan government? Hopefully there can be a transition in Venezuela, and we, the CIA, are doing its best to understand the dynamics there, Pompeo said. I was just down in Mexico City and in Bogota last week where we were talking about this very issue. That's really interesting. The head of the CIA. Right. You were in neighboring right-lean, or not one, in Colombia, in hemispheric right-leaning countries to talk about the CIA's role in a transition in Venezuela. We know that the sanctions, we know that the Venezuelan corporate sector and opposition movement have been connected in some respects to the CIA, and we know that there is an active plan there that in some respects really does mirror, in his example, the destabilization policies in the 1970s in Jamaica. Does this mean that there have not been failings in Venezuela? Absolutely not. But it does mean that John Oliver did a pathetic one-sided segment where he didn't even acknowledge basic facts. In Brazil, several years ago, he did a segment which the opposition that, of course, burgeoned into the lawfare coup that removed Dilma Rousseff on a technicality and has now imprisoned Lula da Silva, ran with and posted all over social media. So my request to you, John Oliver, is maybe do a follow-up segment in Mexico where you get some basic facts right about AMLO's politics and the coalition of people who are tired of being murdered, exploited, oppressed, and the dependence of extortionist clientele networks backed by the traditional parties and U.S. foreign policy. Maybe even loop around a little bit more and recognize that even though maybe your O.J. Simpson joke was cute about Venezuela, but you omitted two of the most important details anybody would need to have in order to comment on Venezuela appropriately with regards to U.S. foreign policy. And also maybe you shouldn't be sort of plaintively asking what the U.S. can do The U.S. has done plenty in Latin America. Perhaps less is the answer. And 3, it's okay that these segments are not as funny as they could be. Spend less time with the joke writers trying to do the dick and empanada jokes and more time with the researchers that can teach you that not everything in the world is Donald Trump. Or if it is Donald Trump, then just focus on Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the greatest menace on the planet right now. He is a massive asshole. You can get endless material out of him. Do it. But if you're going to venture outside of U.S. borders, better to know what the fuck you're talking about. Guys, I know David was very upset about this segment. He's a big John Oliver fan. David?
Yeah, I mean,
I pass it to you.
You know, John Oliver is actually one of the few lanyard liberals that I really like. But I mean, the comparison to Donald Trump is just so obnoxious on so many levels. And I just wanted to note 2 things about AMLO's policies that John Oliver missed.
Yep.
One was to demilitarize the southern border of Mexico with Guatemala, which is
quite Trump-like.
Yeah, exactly.
The idea of
Quite the
demilitarizing a border to improve human conditions there. Very another echo of Trump.
Another was to end to demilitarize the war on drugs in Mexico, which has led to quite scary results with soldiers and stuff like that.
Well, as Trump and Sessions have been working on, they're very concerned by the racial and social justice implications of a failed war on drugs. So I guess that's another good point.
And the last one is that the only AMLO has promised something that is very important, which is in the renegotiations of NAFTA to protect Mexican farmers from U.S. agriculture, which receives incredible subsidies, which is not very much in the spirit of free trade, and it's been devastating to the people. But of course, AMLO has to be this vague politician who's just promising whatever. And instead, if you could really take a moment and look for a second at like the conditions of Mexico and why for a moment that a left politician who's challenging the structure that has sort of destroyed the people of Mexico and put them into this very difficult situation, why that would mean something to them, I don't know. It's just like you don't even need to be a really smart person when it comes to politics to understand why this is happening.
Let me just add really quickly. He completely uncritically talked about the Venezuelan opposition. And I want to be really clear. There is ample legitimate grievance in Venezuela against the Maduro government. Let's not be delusional. But he had no conversation about any of the violent tactics that some of them have employed, which if you want to, I'm certain that John Oliver is not a sympathizer of any type of violent insurrection. He didn't mention that. And with regards to Mexico, he talked about in 2006 when AMLO protested a nail-biter election, which he lost, which was he said was fraudulent loss. That is at the very least, we could say it is a highly credible argument that election
at 1% of the vote.
Less than 1%. Yeah. And a lot of people think it was stolen. And in this election, a lot of people and politicians associated with reform were murdered by cartels during the campaign. So maybe his protesting on the streets of Mexico City in 2006, what many thought was a stolen election, was not just a irrational sore loser syndrome.
I actually probably have the longest experience with John Oliver.
Pray tell.
Listened to his podcast, The Bugle, back when it was still hosted by, I don't think it was the News of the World. What's the Times?
Yeah.
Rupert Murdoch owned. And that is some of the best podcasting ever when they're talking about the phone hacking scandal with Rupert Murdoch, while Rupert Murdoch doesn't realize that he's publishing their podcast, or doesn't really notice that they're even doing it. But every once in a while they tap on the mic, is anybody to listen to this? That's a great podcast, and then they kept it on, and it still persists without John Oliver. But yeah, I think I missed that podcast. I don't really watch his HBO show. Like if I watch late night shows, I think, Jesus and Mero is the best one.
Jesus and Mero is by far the best one. That's the only one I ever watched. Jesus and Mero and Viceland.
And that's not even really. That's not even really politics.
No, it's mainly pop culture. But they're smarter about politics than most people who try to do politics.
Yeah, Jim Jeffries is better than John Oliver is. John Oliver. I mean, nothing's as bad as The Daily Show, but.
I don't watch the Daily Show.
If I have to watch John Oliver, I don't hate it.
Yeah,
his domestic stuff is good, but he did the China bit. I thought that was weird. Just the tone is off. It does seem like it's Voice of America, like propaganda sometimes.
Yeah, it's embarrassing.